Happy Halloween, everybody. If you thought I wasn't going to do a Halloween review this year, you are horribly mistaken. The unfortunate reality is that I just had a lot of stuff get in the way of me actually being able to produce videos over the past couple of weeks, and thus several of my videos ended up getting delayed, including this one. So sorry about that, but here we are with my review of Ghostmaster for PC, Mac, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. And what you're seeing here is, of course, the PC version. This is a strategy game developed by Sick Puppies and published by Empire Interactive in 2003 for PC and Mac, and it saw release on PS2 and Xbox the following year. And on launch it was generally pretty well received, although the PS2 and Xbox versions got weaker ratings than the PC and Mac versions, obviously. Because let's face it, any real-time strategy game just doesn't work anywhere near as well on a console as it does on PC. But regardless of how well it was received, Ghostmaster is a pretty interesting strategy game because unlike in most other games out there, you're actually controlling a series of ghosts and you're trying to basically scare people or make them go insane. It ends up actually being a pretty unique game as a result, so let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as the presentation goes, you do have to keep in mind that this game was released in 2003 and it's looking very dated by modern standards. But even by the standards of 2003, the graphics really aren't all that great. A lot of this is due to the character models almost looking like they're made of clay, which I imagine is probably intentional because they were going for kind of a stylized art style here, but even with that in mind, it still makes the characters themselves tend to look deformed. Now, in the case of the ghosts, that's perfectly fine. In the case of the normal people that are running around the levels, not so much. Texture quality is fairly low, although they do actually put in a fair bit of detail in there, so that really does help things out in the long run. And you do have some okay lighting effects here and there. And when you bring everything together and you consider that it's a strategy game from 2003, it looks okay. It's nothing that really gets in the way of you being able to play the game, it's just that it makes it look even more dated than it actually is. Now what does get in your way a bit is the interface, which is frankly kind of clunky. You click on things and it brings up a drop-down menu, and then you click on something within that drop-down menu, it brings up another drop-down menu, then you click on something within that drop-down menu, and it might bring up a bar that's kind of hard to see. It's certainly not something that you can instantly pick up and play. It does take a brief period of getting used to how the controls work and everything before you can really start to get things going. And once you understand how the interface works, it's usually not that much of a problem, but until you do understand how it works and until you're comfortable using it, it can be fairly annoying to work with. Especially considering that sometimes if you're not precise with your clicks and, for example, you go for a button but you accidentally miss it, well, guess what? Now you gotta go back and open up the menu again to get to where you were. That sort of thing is mildly annoying, but again, once you're used to the controls and you understand that it's going to do that, then you can just take your time and be pretty precise with it and you won't need to worry about that. Now that said, there is one aspect of the visuals in relation to the interface that does become pretty annoying, and that is whenever you have to rotate the camera. You can either use the keyboard or the mouse for this, but if you use the mouse, then it's a bit twitchy on the input, and sometimes it can wildly overextend when you're trying to rotate or zoom or whatever. And unlike the way you click on things in the interface, that never really becomes something you get used to. So the visuals are rather dated, even more so than they ordinarily would be due to the art style, and they've also got a bit of an iffy interface. But what about the sound design? Well, generally speaking, they've actually done a very good job with that. Now it is worth noting that even though the game is about scaring people, it's not scary in the slightest. It's actually rather silly. And if you treat it as a game that's trying to be pretty silly, it actually ends up working out rather well. Namely in the soundtrack department, where most of the tracks make you wonder if you've stumbled into a Saturday morning cartoon's Halloween special. A lot of the tracks are the really goofy kind of stuff that you would pretty much expect from those, and others are a bit zany as you would pretty much expect as well. It's actually something that lends a lot of charm to the game, and you also get that with the voice acting, where you can tell that the actors were just kind of goofing around with it. Most of the lines in the game are laced with either outright silliness or some dark humor, and the game actually has a surprising amount of dark humor in it, which is greatly appreciated. Because if your fairly goofy game about ghosts haunting people did not have any gallows humor in it, then that would just be sad. But I digress. The voice actors themselves actually do a pretty decent job with what they're given. It's just that you gotta keep in mind this was released in 2003. A lot of the voice acting is just gonna be a bit cheesy. But you know what? Cheesy works for this game, so that ends up being fine. And then of course there are the sound effects, which do their job. There's nothing particularly impressive about them. I mean, they don't have any real cool effects on them or anything of that nature, but for what they're trying to do, which is have these sounds of haunting, whether it be something like rattling chains, or these eerie winds, or distant thunderclaps, or whatever, all of these things do have sound effects that end up sounding very appropriate. So at least as far as the presentation goes, you've got sound design that's still got it, but visuals that are looking very dated and an interface that's a bit messy. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are a ghost master. You're basically a spirit that is tasked with tasking other spirits to do hauntings. Beyond that, there's really no story to the game. It's just you go from haunting to haunting, completing the objectives of that specific haunting. This objective is generally to scare everyone in a particular location, but it's not necessarily the only thing you'll be doing. For example, some of them might have you tricking certain characters into doing certain things, or some of them might just have you raise the belief meter of a certain character, or another one might have the various characters have to look for certain items, and once they find those items, then you're good to go. So how do you achieve these objectives? Well, before you start the level, it gives you a quick rundown on what's expected of you, and you also get a loadout screen, so to speak. And in that screen, you select which ghosts you want to bring with you on that particular mission. This is actually very important because some ghosts are a bit more effective at certain things than others. Some are good at attracting the humans to a certain location, some are good at inflicting madness, some are just good at being scary, and then there are certain combinations of ghosts that actually allow you to get more powerful effects by combining their abilities. Now each ghost does have specific fetters that they're allowed to be attached to. A fetter is just an object in the environment that has certain tags attached to it. For example, one of the very first ghosts you get is called Cogjammer, and he's just this kind of gremlin thing that will attach to just about any electronic device. Other ghosts might be able to be attached to emotional objects, or just being outside, or something related to Earth, like plants or dirt or something along those lines, or maybe even just inside or outside a building. This means that a lot of the strategy comes from where you actually place your ghosts to be the most effective. Some of them are good at doing an area effect sort of scare or something along those lines that will allow you to just kind of block off a specific area, and whenever a human tries to go through it, well, they end up getting scared by it. Others are good at attracting the attention of the humans, so you can kind of lure them into a trap, and then maybe with another ghost you actually spring the trap with something that's particularly scary. Now, of course, it is very important to mention that you do start out with a very limited amount of ghosts, and then as you continue through the game, you'll be able to unlock more just by getting to Acts 2 and 3 respectively, and more interestingly, you can actually unlock them within the specific levels. You will find various trapped ghosts in the levels that you're trying to complete, and by completing certain conditions, you can actually unlock that ghost to your team, and then they will be recruitable in any future level. So to give you a prime example of one very early in the game, so as to avoid spoilers as much as possible, there's a brain with 2 eyeballs attached to it as one of the ghosts, and in the level that it's in, that brain is in a jar. So if you manage to knock the jar over and shatter the jar and free the brain, then it will actually join your team. So how do you go about doing something like that? Well, some of your ghosts have abilities that can affect things in the world around them. So for example, if you have something that's related to an electrical switch, then you can set one of the ghosts that affects electrical objects to that switch, and then all of a sudden, whatever that switch was going to affect is now affected. Similarly, if you run into an object that needs to be knocked over, then you might want to use a ghost that's capable of causing earthquakes. But sometimes it's more than simply using a right ghost at the right time to affect that particular object. Sometimes you have to go through a long sequence of events in order to actually unlock those ghosts. Most of the time that's not that big of a deal, but sometimes you will run across a scenario that is very complicated to unlock a certain ghost, and it gets very frustrating to actually unlock that ghost as a result. It's especially irritating when it's a very useful ghost that has abilities that either your own ghosts haven't unlocked yet, or they have abilities that you just don't have access to with any other ghost. This means that if the conditions are specific enough, there are certain ghosts you actually can't unlock without using another specific ghost. And sometimes those specific ghosts that you need in order to unlock that other ghost are in fact unlockable themselves. This ultimately means that the game very heavily pushes you toward a completionist playthrough instead of actually just playing it at your own pace. That actually has a pretty detrimental effect on the game overall, not just because it kind of forces you into playing the game the way the developers wanted you to play it instead of just figuring things out for yourself, but also outright punishing you for not going on a completionist playthrough, because if you don't unlock all of the ghosts, then certain levels later on become very difficult. This especially becomes true once they start introducing enemies on the levels. Now, you start off with just normal humans that you have to scare off, but eventually you'll actually start encountering humans that can fight back. These are mediums, priests, and the so-called ghost breakers. You get exactly one guess as to what the ghost breakers are supposed to be, and if you get it wrong, then that's just plain sad. But anyway, the point with these particular characters is that they can not only detect where ghosts are, but they can actually banish them. Now, if a ghost is banished, then you actually can't use that ghost anymore for that particular level. It doesn't permanently remove them from your repertoire, but it does remove them from your repertoire for that specific level, so this is something you really need to pay attention to when those enemies start showing up. You do actually get a warning whenever a ghost is in danger of being banished, so what you should do in that case is bench them immediately. That completely removes the possibility of them being banished in that particular instant, and you can go ahead and rebind them to somewhere else and make them useful again. Now that's one instance where you would want to bench a ghost. The other instance is if you run out of plasm. This is the one resource you have access to throughout the game, and it increases by you scaring the various people, and of course if you manage to scare one enough that they will actually flee from the scene completely, then you get a substantial increase in plasm. Now plasm is used for both summoning ghosts and binding them to various fetters, and also to increase the amount of powers that they have access to. Now whenever you put a ghost into play, you actually select which power level you want them to exercise. Now this can be anything from just rattling chains on up to things like straight up earthquakes. Each power level has a specific plasm cost, and if you don't have enough plasm, then obviously you can't select that particular level. But whenever you select a power level, it will actually allow that ghost to use everything up to that particular power level, unless you specify something else in their specific orders. Let's go ahead and use Buck as an example. It's one of the very early ghosts that you unlock. It's this kind of spectral dog that's flea infested. And one of the highest tier abilities that it gets, to start with anyway, is called Chase. It's a fairly effective ability that allows them to take on kind of a semi-physical form and chase a human around. Well, if you select that ability, then not only will it use that particular ability, but it will use every ability in every tier leading up to that specific power level. So not only will he chase people around, but he'll also spawn hordes of fleas, for example. This is actually pretty handy because each ability has a cooldown that you need to observe as well, so once you've used a particular ability, especially if it's a powerful ability, it's going to have a fairly long cooldown, and in that amount of time you might have other abilities that have much quicker cooldowns that you're able to use. This means that the ghost isn't just sitting there doing nothing waiting for that ability to recharge. They're also using their other abilities, which have their own cooldown links, and they're able to keep scaring people. But of course, because each of these power levels has its plasm cost, you do have to manage your plasm effectively. You have to bench certain ghosts that aren't particularly suited to a certain situation, and then you have to make the most out of the ghosts that actually are effective in that particular situation. So really the game comes down to managing plasm and managing when your particular ghosts are on the field so that they're not banished, as well as when they're maximized. So despite me saying this is a strategy game earlier, which I mean it is, it's more of a management game than anything else. And it's a fairly limited one at that. Beyond placing ghosts and setting orders for power levels and the conditions for their use, there's really not much to this game at all. Later on when they introduce the enemies, things get a bit more interesting, but eventually they'll start actually using blocking abilities as well and preventing where you can specifically spawn your ghosts. In those instances, it becomes less of a management game and more of a puzzle game, because then you have to go into a very specific order in specific timing in order to be able to take down those various barriers in order to complete your objectives. And since the game's not really designed around that, and it's not something they introduce until fairly late in the game, it's really obvious that they didn't really think that through as well as they could have. Because those segments of the game become very frustrating. They're certainly still doable, it's just that they become a very tedious exercise in patience more than anything else. But here's the real problem. You're probably going to be burned out on the game before you even hit that point. By the time you've hit Act 2, you've experienced everything there is to experience in the game aside from the enemies and those barriers that I mentioned. They don't vary up the mechanics any further than that once you get to Act 2, and by the time you hit Act 3, it's just doing the same thing that you've been doing for the past several levels. There's not really any skill curve once you hit Act 2, it's just more being patient with it and just kind of working around the game's limitations than anything else. And honestly, if it weren't for a couple of levels that just drag on and on, that would actually be mostly fine. Instead, what you have here is a strategy or management game, if you prefer, that's actually not very long. It's only got 15 levels in it, and none of them take you more than maybe an hour at most. The problem is, though, that if they take longer than maybe about 20 to 25 minutes, then they really start to drag, and eventually it just becomes incredibly boring, because most of the time you're just sitting there waiting for people to get scared enough to run away. Or to go insane anyway, but that actually takes even longer than it does to get them to run away, so you probably are just going to end up scaring them off more than making them go insane. And that's just it. Once you've placed your ghosts, you just sit there and wait for things to happen. You might need to reposition one to take advantage of a fleeing person, but other than that, you're probably only going to change things up when an enemy comes in there and starts to track down your ghosts and try to banish them. It's just a very passive game in general, and to make matters worse, there's not really much replay value here. As I mentioned before, the game has 15 levels in it, and that's it. Once you've played through them, there's nothing else. There's no multiplayer, there's no bonus levels, there's no expansion pack. There's only going back and replaying those levels that are already in the game for a higher score. And what does that higher score net you? Well, it gives you more gold plasm, which is what you use to upgrade your various ghosts by actually allowing them to purchase abilities. But it actually takes you quite a while to build up enough gold plasm to be able to really buy the good stuff, and even then, that stuff's not as useful as you might think it would be. A lot of times, those ghosts you unlock actually have those high tier abilities, and thus you just have to put them into play instead of just upgrading whatever ghosts you already have to eventually have that. But of course, that's actually kind of moot, because the upgrades are really only for the next levels that you're going to experience. Because if you go back and you replay a level, then you're only going to have stuff unlocked that would have been unlocked at that point anyway. You can't go back and play through old levels with new ghosts. You can only go back and play them with the ghosts you already had. It's really disappointing. And without multiplayer or co-op or even really a particularly long campaign or varying up the mechanics very much, that means that this is ultimately going to have some very limited appeal, and it's going to wear thin on you very quickly. As a result, it's actually very difficult to recommend Ghostmaster, even though it is a rather unique concept and they've actually done a surprisingly good job of implementing that in a way that makes sense. They just didn't really go far enough with it. There's not really enough on offer here to really justify picking it up unless you get it on sale for really cheap. And even in that instance, it's only a maybe. Because even if you do get it on sale for really cheap, there's not a lot of content on offer here. There's a whole lot of time spent just waiting for things to happen. There's not really much strategic depth to it. And on top of all of that, it has a very annoying pathfinding problem, where people will just get stuck on things, especially stairs, constantly. Which of course taxes your patience even more than it already was taxed just from the core gameplay mechanics. And thus, when you bring everything together, I really can't give this thing any more than a 2 out of 5. It's certainly a very interesting concept, and as far as games go, it is pretty unique. But there's just not very much strategic depth here, and there's not enough content on offer to really justify the asking price. Maybe if you get it on sale for dirt cheap, then it would be worth taking a look at just because it's an interesting and unique concept, but other than that, I'd say you can pretty safely avoid it. Thanks for watching.